students, today we are going to discuss a very important topic of pharmacology, that is drug addiction. Knowledge of drug addiction is also very helpful in our daily life to create awareness in the society. Now this video is 8th in the series of videos on general pharmacology. Now in this video, we will try to understand what is drug addiction, why people take drugs, and the mechanism responsible for the drug addiction. Now, drug addiction is defined as a chronic relapsing brain disease characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use behavior despite harmful consequences. Now, consumption of drugs like, for example, cocaine and heroin produce euphoria. Now, euphoria is a feeling of intense excitement, happiness, and well-being. Now, this feeling of euphoria, that is, this euphoric effect, is so strong and rewarding that it compels the repeated use of drug, craving for the drug, leading to compulsive drug seeking and use behavior of the individual. The addict tries to find out and consume drug at any cost. The addict finds it's impossible to live without the drug. So very important to understand that addiction is characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use behavior. Now some of the drugs causing addiction include, for example, nicotine in cigarettes, then alcohol, then marijuana, cocaine, amphetamine, then MDMA, that is 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, LSD, that is lysergic acid diethylamide, heroin, anabolic steroids, etc. Now, some prescription medications also produce addiction. For example, oxycodone, a painkiller, then drugs like diazepam, alprazolam, these are anti-anxiety and sedative medicines. Then drugs like methylphenidate hydrochloride used in the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now, in order to understand mechanism of drug addiction, it's essential to first understand normal functioning of mesolimbic dopamine reward pathway. Now, look at this figure. It shows right hemisphere of the brain. And this diagram explains functioning of mesolimbic dopamine reward pathway. Now, this structure is called as a ventral tegmental area. This is nucleus accumbens. This is amygdala, hippocampus, and this area of the brain is called as a frontal cortex. Now, activities like eating food, for example, chocolates, shopping, social interaction with friends, colleagues, family members, a verbal praise, a hug, music, sex, etc. stimulate this mesolimbic dopaminergic reward pathway. And this triggers release of dopamine in the ventral tegmental area. And from this ventral tegmental area, dopamine goes to all these areas. Now, this gives a feeling of pleasure and happiness. So, dopamine rewards our natural behavior. Natural behavior of eating, shopping, social interaction, etc. and thus makes us feel happy. Now, all of us have experienced this pleasure that is derived from dopamine pathway. So, stimulus like eating chocolates, listening to good music of our taste stimulate ventral tegmental area of the brain and dopamine is released. Dopamine is released at the ventral tegmental area. Now, ventral tegmental area sends dopamine to nucleus accumbens, amygdala, prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. Now, role of amygdala is to control and feel emotions like pleasure. Nucleus accumbens control motor functions of the body, stimulating motor activities responsible for inducing in the act that gives natural reward. Prefrontal area controls attention and planning and focus on the act of giving reward. while hippocampus control memory and memorize or remember the act that gave reward or the act that produced the feeling of pleasure. So all these four brain structures are stimulated by dopamine released at ventral tegmental area and play a very important role in rewarding our natural behavior of eating, social interaction, a verbal praise, etc. Look at this figure. This is a presynaptic neuron and this is a postsynaptic neuron. Now, activities like, for example, eating, hug, music, shopping stimulate the reward pathway. Now, let's say here food, food of a choice. For example, eating chocolates or pizza or a sweet stimulate the presynaptic neuron and this causes release of dopamine. Now, dopamine here is shown as green dots. Now, dopamine is released at the ventral tegmental area. Now, this dopamine binds to the dopamine receptors which are located at amygdala, nucleus accumbens, prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. Now, this stimulates the reward pathway. Normal signals are produced and this gives a feeling of pleasure and happiness. So, here in this case, dopamine has rewarded our natural behavior of eating chocolate or pizza or sweet and we feel happy. Now, very important, this feeling of pleasure is responsible for our involvement and desire to eat the food of our taste again and again. But there is no addiction because we are rewarded not only by food but also by other activities like listening to music of our choice, talking with our friends, going for a long drive. All this also makes us happy. Now, drugs like cocaine, heroin, then lysergic acid diethylamide overstimulates the reward pathway. Now, release of dopamine is increased 2 to 10 times of its normal concentration in the ventral tegmental area. And apart from this, these drugs like cocaine, they also block these dopamine transporters which are shown here in the yellow color. So these drugs like cocaine also block dopamine transporters, inhibiting reuptake of the dopamine from the synapse into the presynaptic neuron. Now, function of these dopamine transporters is to transport dopamine from the synapse back into the presynaptic neuron. So, blocking these dopamine transporters further increase concentration of dopamine at the synapse. Now, exaggerated release of dopamine overstimulates reward pathway and amplified signals are produced, and these amplified signals produce euphoric effect. That is a feeling of intense pleasure, intense excitement or over excitement, feeling of intense well-being and extreme happiness. And this euphoric effect lasts much longer. And this reinforces repeated consumption of drug, repeated consumption of cocaine or any other drug. And very important to understand that this euphoric effect cannot be derived from any other natural activity. There is no other natural activity or there is no other natural substitute which can produce this euphoric effect. And therefore, this induces craving for the drug, and this euphoric effect is responsible for the habituation, further resulting in the addiction. Now, during this process, exaggerated amount of dopamine is released at ventral tegmental area. Then amygdala feels this euphoric effect produced by the drug. Now, nucleus accumbens control motor function and thus it is involved in the act of consuming drug. Prefrontal cortex controls attention and planning and thus plans how to seek out the drug, how to find the drug, how to search the drug. while hippocampus controls memory function and thus remembers the euphoric experience. That is how consumption of drug produced euphoria. So this induces craving for the drug, repeated consumption of the drug at frequent intervals leading to habituation followed by addiction of the drug. Now let's summarize the process of drug addiction. Now, drugs like cocaine overstimulate dopamine reward pathway. This causes exaggerated or excessive release of dopamine at the synapse in the ventral tegmental area. Now, this produces euphoric effect characterized by intense feeling of pleasure, well-being, happiness, extreme excitement. And this euphoric effect lasts much longer, for a long time. And this motivates the individual to take the drug again and again. But very important to remember that our brain always believe in homeostasis, that is stability. Brain does not like euphoric effect. Brain desires for normal feeling of pleasure. So homeostatic mechanisms are initiated by the brain. And the purpose of these homeostatic mechanisms is to reduce the concentration of dopamine that is released at the ventral tegmental area. So the body first reduces production of dopamine, and secondly there is a down regulation or reduction in the number of dopamine receptors that receive the signals. So response of dopamine reward pathway reduces. So now to perceive or to experience the same euphoric effect, larger amount of the drug is required, and this results in the gradual development of tolerance. So now the individual starts consuming more amount of drug. Impact of dopamine on the reward circuit becomes abnormally low, and over a period of time consumption of the drug is required to reward even the normal behavior of eating, social interaction, sex, etc. And thus, eventually, addict feels depressed, flat, lifeless, and is unable to enjoy things that are normally pleasurable. Now, this causes compulsive drug-seeking behavior, and the addict finds impossible to live without the drug. So, addiction is a chronic compulsive disease, and addiction is a brain disease. So, addiction impairs cognitive functions, then erodes or completely destroy person's self-control and ability to make sound decisions. Now, consequences of drug addiction are very harmful and are observed at medical, social, economical, and criminal fronts. For example, drug addiction deteriorates health, causes conflicts, increases economic burden and criminal incidences like drug trafficking. So this is in brief on the concept of drug addiction and how it develops. If you find the video useful, kindly like, subscribe and share this video. Thanks for watching this video.